Um, there we go. Sarah says, all hail any sound. Yeah, I understand that everyone can hear us now. Yeah, okay. So welcome everybody to this event. This is PPV number 18. In other words, the 18th event of the Perverting the Power Vertical Politics and Aesthetics in the Global East seminar series. And also this event is part of the Institute for Advanced Study, the UCL Institute for Advanced Studies 5th year anniversary festival, which goes under the name of Alternative Epistemologies. And we're the penultimate event in the festival just before the inaugural lecture by Professor Paul Gilroy, starting at 5 o'clock. It's wonderful to have everybody here. BPV is convened by myself and Michal Murawski. I'm a lecturer in critical area studies at the School of Slavonic East European Studies at UCL, and also by Masha Mileva, who's lecturer in art history at the Courtauld Institute. Unfortunately, isn't able to be here due to unavoidable last-minute complications, so sends her apologies and her greetings to everyone here, and also by Denis Maximov, who is a founder of the Avenir Institute and a London-based curator and theorist. So I think without any further delay, it being 5 past now, I'm going to just introduce Keti and hand over to her for the remainder of the event. So as we all know, we are here today to launch Keti's fantastic book. This is a launch that we've been planning for a long time. We were unable to do it in real life yet, but hopefully we still will be able to. This is Keti's book. Keti also has her book behind her in multiple editions, so you can see the cover, entitled Practicing the Good, Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism. We'll hear all about the book in a second. It's a fantastic work, so I do recommend you all to buy it and to read it if you haven't done so already. Keti is an associate professor at the Department of Cultural Studies at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. She's authored numerous texts on art, theory, and philosophy. Her full-length books, including To Be, To Perform, Theatre and the Philosophical Critique of Art, and Pound, as well as a volume of dramatic writing, Merely Humans. And she's also recently put on a play called, I think, The Global Congress of Post-Prostitution, which was premiered, if I'm not mistaken, at the Steirische Herbst Art Festival in Graz in 2019, so almost 2 years ago already. And so, yeah, Keti, over to you to introduce your book.
Thanks, Michal. I thank Institute of Advanced Studies and Perverting Power Vertical, Michal Murawski and Maria Mileva, for organizing this event. And I'm truly delighted that my comrades and wonderful, brilliant colleagues are here with me, and such a brilliant audience too. And really thrilled that this is so planetary, international. Berlin, London, New York, Santiago, Moscow, London, and Athens even. So just a few words about the book, because we don't have so much time, certain highlights about it. Actually, when I was starting to work on it, certain topics of it, such as, for instance, basic need or de-alienation or critique of enjoyment, were met with quite fierce argument. And it's interesting that precisely these issues during the pandemic became quite important and discussed. The non-growth ecology and economy, discussion of decline of enjoyment, de-alienation, return to basic need economy, precisely by those who were insisting that it represents, I don't know, much more a totalitarian society. So the book actually has two principal goals, not simply to talk about communism, but to first and foremost inscribe it into the context of continental thought after Second World War, and see what changes after such inscription of cultural ethics of communism and its ideology into this context. And second, to reinterpret certain stereotypical standpoints that we constantly come across about historical socialism in seminal texts of critical theory after 60s. And I will list those very well-known stereotypical ideas on socialism. First, anti-capitalist resistance is closer to communism than historical socialism is, which we come across in Balibar Althusser. Second, socialist economy is nothing but state capitalism. Three, libidinal desire was coercively banned by party bureaucracy from above. And fourth, after the early revolutionary years, Soviet art and culture loses its modernizing potential. And fifth, philosophy in the conditions of socialism is confined to simply diamat dogmaticism and naive metaphysics. So these stereotypes are just, the list of those stereotypes could be prolonged. I will just stop here to unwind how I was dealing with them. And actually, I started with analyzing epistemological divergences that we witness in the way certain crucial notions of emancipatory thought are posited in capitalist leftist critique and the socialist one, respectively. And result of this comparison of how these notions are dealt in capitalist context or socialist context, respectively, brought me to certain conclusions, namely that what was dismissed negatively as metaphysical, idealist, and marked as ideology in the post-Althusserian critical thought, the ideal, culture, language, consciousness, the common good, the universal, was acquiring affirmative and materialist connotations in the thought of historical socialism. And conversely, what epitomized emancipation in anti-capitalist critical theories in 60s, pleasure, desire, transgression, subversion, the unconscious, was approached in socialist context as the embodiment of capitalist sociality and abstracted alienation. So I had to answer the question why it is so. And as the book argues, these divergences have nothing to do with the East and West confrontation or broadly geopolitics, nor so much with the restrictions from the party, but rather these epistemic divergences were placed by me in the politico-economic context to find politico-economic causality of these divergences, which means that the frequently converse approaches to the essential notions forming sociality, ontology, ethics in socialist and capitalist contexts, respectively, do not necessarily derive from party imperatives, but are consequences of sequestered capitalist conditions, such as shift from surplus value economics to the use value economics and broadly abolished private property. In other words, the notions that in the conditions of capitalist production denote certain universal rules of ontology and become dead metaphysical abstractions to be subverted in the context of socialist acquire concrete material body and appliance. And that's why we come across in the aesthetics and ethics and anthropology of socialism, with such notions treated as emancipatory as culture, universal, the ideal, language, labor, reality, etc. Consequently, it means that I could make an allegation that after revolutionary socialist society is able to build not only sociality, but even gnoseology and ontology otherwise, which actually is confirmed in socialist philosophy as well, claiming that Marxist political economy is not merely a social or economic tool solely, but it unravels Marxist economic analysis as a field of philosophic gnoseology, and conversely, philosophic gnoseology becomes part and parcel of sociality. So quite like socialist production and political economy becomes polygon of philosophic speculation, it is at the same time functioning as the tools of social construction. And this convergence of political economy and philosophy is unprecedented and can be considered and observed precisely in socialist context. Now, before I, in a very concise way, enlist how I was unwinding the above mentioned stereotypes in the socialist context, I want to mention how historical socialism is imagined in certain kind of accelerationist communist utopias, and in works such as, among others, Aron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism. Why I mention this? Because it is important that we often imagine communism as a certain kind of Promethean abundance, prosperity, a certain kind of non-ending post-scarcity, which can be accomplished merely by technical growth. And this idea that technical growth can immediately provide us with expanded opportunities of communization is quite popular nowadays. I think such approach ignores the crucial features of capitalism, that scarcity in it is not caused simply by insufficient development of technology, but it is as well the outcome of surplus desire and surplus enjoyment, which inevitably reveal themselves in surplus value economics and consequently entail drastic inequalities in the distribution of goods, resources, and living opportunities. And this is why it was so important for me to put in the center of the work the idea of libidinal economy and generally the history of how it was treated. And one of those persons who was seriously researching it, Samo Tomsic, is here. He wrote the book Capitalist Unconscious and the Labor of the Enjoyment. And the first question that we have to ask, what is scarcity? We cannot say scarcity is treated the same way in capitalist context and this socialist context. What is scarcity for a capitalist subject might not be scarcity for a socialist subject, and might not be, and might be on the contrary, a plenitude and wealth. So it was very important, therefore, to deal with these works on libidinal economy, starting with Deleuze up to Samo Tomsic. And interestingly, this libidinal element is traced already in Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, when he talks that private property is grounded in the urgency of need. So it's not so easy to simply decline it by technologic excellence. Production in these conditions functions as encourager of new enjoyments and novelties, and this growth of urges generates the lack and hence transforms surplus necessity into surplus value, and this machine cannot terminate in capitalist condition. conditions. And to conclude, I will just list how I actually treat just three stereotypical approaches to Soviet socialism. First, unlike the acknowledged opinion, according to which socialism decomposed because of its insufficient application of communism, because of communism's lack, I allege that the problem of distortions in socialism is caused by the excessive extent of communism ahead of time, which actually became unbearable existentially while being emancipatory socially. So the question is to us as to capitalist subjects, how much common good, how much non-libidinal economy we would desire or we would want to endure at all. Second, although socialist production was associated with growth of productive forces, in fact, the non-libidinal use-value economy resulted in the condition when the productive forces, when technology had to lag behind the relations of production. Yet this productive inefficiency, paradoxically, to a certain extent realized the socialist goal of suppression of commodity form. And paradoxically, the slowdowns in efficiency, in production, in very modest standards of living can be associated with the freedom from libidinal logic of production. Actually, it's a paradox and I wasn't even able to solve it. And third, very important issue that had already been mentioned by me, that socialist political economy enables to pave the way to the studies of the dialectical convergence of thinking and being, mind and matter, which is the crucial issue in the history of philosophy and the convergence of which was so excessively developed in the socialist thought. Why is this? Because without surplus value economy and commodity logic, the objecthood and physical existence can become burdened by the ideational parameters. And this is also very specific condition for the socialist sociality, which is also discussed in the book, The Communist Postscript by Boris Groys, where he emphasizes precisely this nominal character of material think, food, and culture in socialist conditions. Thus, I would end here mentioning that this idea of converging matter and concept in socialist thought actually contested and disputed critique of metaphysics that happened in the Western philosophy, because in the Western context, Althusserian and post-Althusserian context, critique of metaphysics could only shift into structuralism. So materialist dialectics was suggesting to keep both idea and reality intact, so that by means of converging, we could evade its alienated abstraction. So many questions, but I would end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keti. I wish we could all applaud. Well, we are applauding. I suppose there's an applaud button actually on Zoom that you can use to express your applause virtually. And I just want to add that, I mean, Keti really traces there's an incredible comparative job throughout the book, tireless kind of comparison between the epistemes and the ontics as they developed in a distinctive manner. I mean, I suppose it's a sort of strategic binary in a way. Perhaps you could say that Keti performs both in the actually existing socialist East and in the anti-capitalist capitalist West, and as this and the manifestations of this in the sphere of political economy, sexuality, aesthetics, cinema. So it's a really, the book really tangibly lays out this this analysis throughout. So I highly recommend having a look at the table of contents, at least online, just to get a sense of the way in which this analysis is carried out. So I just wanted to say to everyone, feel free as and when you think of a question or a point that you'd like to make, to type it into the chat box. And then we'll collect the questions at the end of the panelists' presentations. But whoever types in their questions first gets to ask the first question. So it's a first come, first served basis. So let's move now, since we'll do the Q&A at the end, we'll move on to our first respondent from our extremely distinguished panel of respondents who've agreed to join us today. And the first respondent I'll introduce is Boris Groys, who, well, as one says in these circumstances, needs no introduction. So I won't do a very long introduction, but I'll just do a short introduction. Boris Groys is a global distinguished professor of Russian and Slavic studies at New York University. He's an art critic, philosopher, essayist, author of a myriad of works on Moscow conceptualism, on socialist and post-socialist art. His probably most famous book is The Total Art of Stalinism from 1992. The English version was published in 1992, but as well known are his books, History Becomes Form on Moscow Conceptualism, Art, Power, the more recent, The Communist Postscript, and I think the most recent book is the Russian Cosmosm book from 2018, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe there's been something since then. Who knows? No pressure. Anyway, so I'll stop here and turn over to Boris for his response to Keti's book.
Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to react to the book of Keti's book. I know her work for a long time. And so I'm very glad that it is presented in this way to the global audience, I would say. Of course, Keti's book, as every book, can be read in different ways. So let me propose a certain reading, which is one of possible readings, of course. Namely, as a reaction to a certain tradition of the Western critique of capitalism, as a critique of power, authority, and order in the name of emancipation, desire, and body with its needs and drives. In the framework of this critique, every kind of power and authority is understood as intrinsically bad and oppressive, and every protest against it as intrinsically good. Also, actually, protest against socialism, real socialism, understood as embodiment of authority and power. And specifically, critique of the state that embodies power and authority, seen as intrinsically bad, because under the condition of capitalism, the state is serving the class interest of the bourgeoisie. Keti formulates it in the following way: the wrongness of the capitalist order, I quote her, is confused with the wrongness of order as such. In this case, not merely capitalist order, but any order stands for power, totality, subjection, universality. Actually, universality is seen as negative, control, and embodies the wrongness of capital. It is, of course, the case. But here the question emerges: is it possible that power, authority, and state become good? That means that they begin to serve not the class interest of the bourgeoisie, but the common good. Now, Keti argues that the Soviet power was such a good power. It is basically her argument, that cared about the common good because the private property was abolished. There was no private interest anymore, only the common interest. It is actually already a Platonic argument that if you abolish all the private interests and only the common interest remain, and that would be the philosophical ideal state. Of course, there can be different opinions concerning the question of the Soviet power. Was it a good power or not? There is a lot of controversies around that. But these opinions are actually irrelevant for Keti's argument. The question that she raises is a more general one. Is the assumption that every power or every authority are intrinsically bad a correct assumption? So is it possible, beyond the question if Soviet power was good power, is the question valid to ask, is a good power possible? Is a good authority theoretically possible? Here one can say that this question was rarely discussed during the recent decades. Indeed, when I try to remember a relatively recent text on the notion of authority, I could only remember the book by Alexander Kozhev under this title, The Notion of Authority, written in the middle of Second World War. But let us repeat the question in the following form. Can we say that the notions of authority, power, and state are specifically bourgeois notions? Actually, it is not the case. Already Marx described the capital as a power of negation that destroys all the traditional orders, authorities, hierarchies. There is no doubt that the anti-authoritarian rhetoric makes the work of the capital on the theoretical level. So power of capital is already a power of negation of any order. And that means that anti-authoritarian attitude repeats the work, repeats and expands the work of capital. In this respect, it often coincides with a right-wing rhetoric that is directed against a social state, public authority, and central planning. So in a very strange way, anti-state right-wing rhetoric coincide with a certain kind of left-wing rhetoric. What feels this very clear way when one lives in USA, as I do it now, when this right-wing rhetoric of liberation, against the state, is so developed. In her book, Keti does not only speak about good authority and power, she speaks about the subject living under this condition of a good power. And he speaks in this context about the virtue. The virtue is, of course, a religious, but also a military notion. It presupposes discipline, asceticism, and a rejection of excessive consumption. But first of all, the virtue means the readiness for a sacrifice for the common good and common project. And indeed, the ethics and also aesthetics of the Soviet socialism required from an individual to sacrifice its immediate desires for the communist future. In general, communism appeals to the ethics of engagement, of commitment to the communist ideal that can also lead, and mostly leads, to a personal sacrifice. It's interesting that Keti also mentioned Sartre positively in her text and his ethics of engagement. That is also has this sacrificial aspect. And here one can agree with Keti, not desire, but ethics of sacrifice offer the most radical opposition to the bourgeois culture of self-preservation, individual success, and spectacular consumption. But there's one point that should not be overlooked. Individuals are ready to follow a certain authority and to submit themselves to a certain power if they believe that this authority and power are leading them to the better future. The anti-authoritarian attitude is, on the contrary, an attitude of the fundamental disbelief in such a possibility. Not disbelief in this or that particular authority, but disbelief in a possibility of a good authority. It is based on the decision to reject any claim of power to be a good power as deceptional, even before considering this claim. There is no doubt that this fundamental, I would even say fundamentalist, distrust toward any power has its historical legitimation. It reflects a long history of deceptions and disappointments. However, a political movement that only wants to undermine power will never become powerful. So what is very strange about this kind of rhetoric is some kind of tacit readiness to capitulate before the struggle began. And even if an individual decides not to sacrifice itself for any common project, the individual will not escape death. Indeed, already Hegel said that in the post-historical time, in which we are not ready to trust any historical movement or any historical authority in action, that death becomes our absolute master. The idea that actually started Lacanian discourse in many others. Now, Keti is pleading for the openness to a different choice, openness towards belief, towards trust, towards the possibility of belief and trust, for the choice to re-enter this history. So they re-enter the history as history of political struggle for power. It is, of course, a difficult choice, but it's precisely the choice that makes Keti's book, at least for me, so unusual and stimulating.
Thank you very much, Boris, for that really provocative and deep response to Keti's book. I think, Keti, you've been writing things down, haven't you? So, I mean, I would like to, it'd be nice if we could have sort of responses by responses, but I think in the interest of time, perhaps it'd be best if you could collect your thoughts and remember your responses to Boris, and after the four panelists, you can respond to them collectively. So many thanks, Boris, and we'll move on now to our second panelist, Vijay Prashad, who is also, I think, needs no introduction. I mean, Vijay is an absolutely prolific writer, theorist of ideology, political economy, politics, culture, author of dozens of books, absolutely incredible number of books. I think the first book that I'm aware of is The Karma of Brown Folk from 2000, but perhaps there were other books before. And then the most recent two books, one of these is Red Star Over the Third World, which is extremely exciting. I mean, it is study and analysis and kind of critical ode, I suppose, to the way in which the specter of the revolution has inspired and been and mutated in a positive sense throughout the global South over the last century. And the most recent book, which has been very widely commented upon, is Washington's Bullets from 2020 with Left World Books. And I understand from your Facebook page, Vijay, that you're currently in the process of making a soundtrack to Das Kapital based on The Clash, if I'm not mistaken.
Not entirely The Clash, but it's going to require all my guitar skills, and we'll have an album of what to listen to while you're reading Marx, particularly Capital. It's great to be here. Thanks, Michal. It's nice to see friends like Joshua, Angela, and others. Great to be here. Keti, congratulations on your book. About 10 years ago, I was writing a column in an Indian magazine, and I was taken to lunch in Delhi by one of the leading Marxist economists who, after he bought me lunch, pushed his chair back and said to me, "You should stop writing about economics." And I was embarrassed immediately. And he said, "You know, you should just write about what you know, and you don't know anything about economics." So I'm afraid I don't know anything about what we're talking about today. I know Marxism pretty well. I know Lenin better than Marx, perhaps, because I love Lenin. I said above me there is a picture of Lenin drawn by a young Chinese artist. I don't know philosophy at all, guys, so I'm at a loss here, and I'm sorry to intrude, but I thought this is a very important subject, so I wanted to make some remarks based on the reading I've done of the book. It's okay to enter into domains that are different, because guess what? Nothing human is alien to me, said the old man. Nothing human is alien to me, and philosophy is human. So I'm sorry, here goes. At the institute that I run, Tricontinental, we just released a text along with a group called EFDDR, and I'm going to put this in the chat, put the link at least to the English version. It's there oh, wait a minute. It's there in Spanish, Portuguese, German, and so on. It's a text about going back to recover the history and the meaning of the DDR, the German Democratic Republic, which lasted only half the average male lifestyle of a German. Please just think about this. The German Democratic Republic lasted half the average male lifespan. That's incredible. And people like me from India who came to the GDR as in a youth brigade found it completely different than what I read later in the Western press. I couldn't recognize the GDR because the Western press just saw it as a Stasi state. I saw it as the great defender of national liberation, met people from Zambia, met people from the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party being trained just outside Berlin in armed struggle and so on. It was a completely different episode. I found people there who, and this is what Keti's book made me remember, who had such an incredible confidence in their bodies, men and women confident with their bodies. And I don't just mean sexually, although sexually very confident with their bodies, but also just in their physicality. They were not like the rest of us who grew up with a great deal of anxiety about who we were. They seemed so free. And we looked at them and thought, my God, this is what it must have meant for a mortal to travel to Mount Olympus. Amazing. I mean, who are these people? They have such clarity about their place in the world, which we, of course, don't have. So I'd like you to take a look at that, because I think Keti's work is part of this broader attempt to recover and revive a discussion about the great advances that took place in those experiments, because they were experiments. Nobody said they were perfect. We are striving for something like perfection, but we understand that perfection is not something we attain. And to then judge the Soviet experiment on the basis of perfection is itself a bourgeois plot, a capitalist plot. It sets us up into something that therefore we will mock and say, look at this, they had lines outside shops. I saw at the beginning of the pandemic, cars lined up. And I'm coming back to cars, Keti, because there's a section where you talk about cars that I wanted to return. Cars lined up in Texas because people can't feed themselves in that ridiculous thing called the United States of America. In that ridiculous thing called the United States of America, people in cars lined up to get food because there was no food. And then we still mock the lines in the USSR at times of scarcity. Imagine that. It does not dent, as it were, the concept United States of America or capitalist society, which is a pathetic concept. Yet somehow that doesn't get dented. This is a battle of ideas. This is not simply a matter of conceptual clarity. This is politics. That's the second point I want to make. I think this is a real contribution as part of that debate in the battle of ideas. The third thing I want to make is I think Western Marxism has failed itself, including somebody I greatly admire, Eric Hobsbawm, in this book that came toward the end of their life, How to Change the World. It just tells you how Western Marxism skips over theory from the rest of the world. In this book, you have the pre-World War I Marxists and then Gramsci. There's no Lenin. There's no interrogation of Lenin. There's no discussion of any Marxist outside Europe. It's as if we do not exist. Nothing. It's Gramsci, no Lenin, no interest in any Soviet thinker. Soviet thought disappears from this entire tradition. It's, I think, quite scandalous, firstly, that Western Marxism sequesters Gramsci and Lukács without an understanding of their communist commitments, and their communist thinking, their contribution to communist thought. They sequester them into a cultural politics, which I find objectionable. And this continues. You still get this leap over the Soviet, and therefore a leap over Cuban Marxism, a leap over Chinese Marxism, a leap over Indian Marxism. Who among you has ever read EMS Nambudripad, for instance? He's not taken seriously. He is a serious Marxist theorist. Who is engaged properly with the ideas of Jose Carlos Mariátegui? Not very many people. And Cuban Marxism, as I said, completely leapt over. So there is this leap, from the pre-October to Gramsci, who we used to joke and say is the Marxist you can take back home because he's okay to date once in a while. You leap over October to Gramsci, you communistize or whatever Gramsci and make him somebody who just reflects on culture. Seriously, this guy is in an Italian fascist prison trying to figure out how to make a communist revolution and why it is that our key class, abandoned the left for the fascists. That's the question he's asking, not how do I understand culture and consumption and so on. That's not his main, that's not the conceptual field he's working in. And yet that's where he goes. He becomes the leader of a kind of cultural studies sort of, field of study. It's very interesting that happens to Gramsci, and then Lukács goes to the Frankfurt School and so on, prehistory of the these people have different commitments and different things they're trying to work out in the world, which is much closely related. Lukács and Gramsci much more closely related to Marxists in the third world, much more closely related to Marxists in the third world. At Leftward, we are just bringing out a book by EMS Nambudripad and P. Govinda Pillai, which reflects on Gramsci, tries to understand Gramsci from the standpoint of Kerala. How should somebody in Kerala read Gramsci? To my mind, much more interesting than any reflection on Gramsci made, particularly in Britain and the United States, where he becomes just completely without politics. So that's the third point. Sorry, I've got 5 points. I'll go over pretty rapid fire. The fourth point is this issue of productive forces. Every single revolution that took place after October took place in the so-called realm of necessity. Every single revolution, October, then Mongolia, Vietnam, China, Cuba. Germany didn't have a revolution. France, England, Canada, the United States, none of them. And so these are, in that sense, Leninist revolutions because they make a certain very particular point. And I'm going to put in the chat another text we did at Tricontinental that I hope that you'll have a look at if you can, if you have time. The point we make is that the Leninist charge to a country like, say, China, is that you cannot wait for capitalism to advance the productive forces because in a colonial context, it's not going to happen. You'll be waiting forever. So you have to both do a national liberation revolution. You have to seize power over the commanding heights. Then you have a dual charge, very complicated charge, nothing reflected in Marx on this. You have to advance the productive forces and you have to socialize production. These dual things have been a charge from October to Cuba to Thomas Sankara's Burkina Faso and so on. This is not a problem that has been dealt with in Western Marxism because Western Marxism has never had to reflect on an actual revolution. It has never had to reflect on the complexities of an actual revolution. It has never had to reflect on the complexities of an actual revolution. By the way, that wasn't a glitch in the computer. That was me repeating myself 3 times so that the point is totally clear. It has never had to reflect on the problems of an actual revolution. And that is why China is so interesting because China is, you see in the last period, has had to zigzag, to use Engels' term, has had to zigzag between advancing productive forces and socializing production and creates all kinds of problems and has all kinds of disasters, but it's trying to work on a project. And we have to deal with that. We have to understand it for what it is, not judge the Chinese experiment based on, again, some utopian idea of Marxist futures and so on. These are actual existing projects with actual existing dilemmas that are drawn from historical limitations. Finally, the last point I want to make is on cars. Keti makes a point in there about, well, I like this idea because, you see, look at capitalism. Capitalism is about abundance of goods. Remember the first line of Marx's Capital, it's about abundance of commodities, but scarcity of access. Abundance of commodities, scarcity of access. Who can keep buying cars every year or buy 3 cars or whatever, unless you take credit and then you just maul yourself for generations? It's abundance of good, scarcity of access. Now, what is so great about being able to produce new models of cars repeatedly? There's a point that you made, Keti. You quote from people about Soviet scientists who say they don't necessarily use the most recent technology if the old one is pretty good. Like, if it's able to be pretty good, why change the whole production line in order to facilitate a new technology? Look at what happens to computers. Every few years, your computer is totally out of date because the operating system won't function. This is a capitalist plot to make more and more ecological crisis, because you have to keep getting new computers, you have to keep upgrading things, you have to keep spending money to do something which 5 years ago computer would do just as well. You don't need a new computer, but this is that way of getting you to throw things away to buy more things. Much better system to have public transport, whether boring or beautiful. I am in favor of public buses that are spray painted by young people. Let them go and paint the buses, do whatever chaos they want, because as I learned from Joshua, the kids love communism. Let them have fun with their art on buses. Make public buses, don't have private cars. Desire has to be changed. We have a real problem here, because we are trying to fight against a kind of desire produced by capitalist history. It has produced a certain kind of desire for commodities, and we have to go against this. But you can't go against this by enforcing Puritanism. How do you create a new kind of desire, new sets of aspirations, and so on? I think this is our task. In Kerala, and I'm going to end here, in Kerala, for instance, where our government was just re-elected, a big mandate in the state elections. It's a state of 35 million people. It's not a tiny part of the world. The communist government has had 5 years. It just won re-election. It's a big achievement to win re-election. One of the big things that the government is interested in is complete experimentation with form and content. I went back when I did a edition for Leftward of selections from Lenin. Half the book I made was from Lenin after 1917. There's a speech Lenin gives to the youth leagues where he talks about the need for vegetable gardens. It's a beautiful section. He's talking not just about food, that you need to increase food production. He's talking about practice, and I don't mean praxis, I mean just practice. The fact of being there with each other, gardening, young people doing something of interest. I remember visiting Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit many years ago, and she took me for a walk through her community gardens, and she argued that elders and young people were able to get together, and the young people saw older people had experience in gardening, in agriculture, in fact, not just gardening, they were growing food crops, and that the older people could give their wisdom to younger people. I mean, I just thought that was the most beautiful example of the construction of socialism. Socialism isn't just constructed. We know that, those of us who are committed communists, we know socialism is not just constructed by, socializing the advanced sectors. You have to socialize consciousness. You have to socialize the practical aspects of everyday life. Public goods are very important for this. This is why capitalism also hates public goods. They know it sets up in consciousness the experience of socialism. Public health, public education, public parks, public transportation, public goods are our school. Toward the end of his life, Marx wrote a piece where he talked about cooperatives as possible communism. I love this phrase. In Kerala, we have a cooperative with almost 7 million members. It's called Kudumbushri. It's an all-women cooperative. During the pandemic, Kudumbushri makes a range of goods, clothes, food, and so on. During the pandemic, the leadership of Kudumbushri said, we have to do something. They just started making hand sanitizers and face masks, and they made enough for the state's 35 million people. It's an incredible thing. This is the practical application of socialism in our lives. Socialism is in our consciousness. It's not just some structure. We've got to understand these things all happening simultaneously. It's not just in our consciousness and not in the structure. It's not just structural change. It's also in our consciousness. It's all these things being done experimentally and dialectically. Thanks a lot.
Very much, Vijay, for that tour de force, and really we're getting, I think we're seeing that Keti's book is able to exercise vigorous responses from very different disciplinary backgrounds, from very different approaches. And it was also quite magical that as somebody was writing in the chat, what about practice? How do you actually do this? Vijay was literally laying out a series of steps for how to go about implementing things. So we'll move on now to Angela for her responses. Angela Dimitrakaki also needs no introduction, is a senior lecturer and contemporary art history and theory at the University of Edinburgh, has published an extraordinary prolific body of work, most recent book being, as far as I know, Economy, Art Production and the Subject in the 21st Century.
Thank you. It's fine. Thanks. Yes. Okay. I'm very keen. Well, thank you very much. And to everyone who's here for the invitation, and to Keti for writing this book. Because I think for me, practicing the good dealt with an abyss. And it dealt with it by finally bringing it into public view. And this abyss, as I understood it, is that between the outlook of a society that is based on surplus and one that sought to annihilate the surplus, to use her terminology. So many years back, tired with confronting colleagues from the so-called Eastern Bloc, that used to tell me their social experience was different to mine. Mine was referred to as European. I ended up arguing that Europe is post-socialist in general, and that post-socialism should not be used to refer exclusively to the experience of those societies that had once existed in the sphere of the so-called Soviet influence. And what I meant was that there was a general sense of socialism's defeat, that social democrats had done, the best to betray socialism core values and allowed anti-communism to be the ground of politics in various ways. And so practicing the good both helped me understand in a deeper way what I meant back then, but also forced me to re-examine whether this assessment that there was a general post-socialist experience was right or not. And I would say that Keti's book shows that as far as Western anti-capitalist critique is concerned, the experience was not post-socialist, but anti-socialist. She writes, and I'm going to quote her here, it's from the end of the book, disappointment in the Soviet socialist experiment eliminated all aspirations for a critical theory that would posit radical anti-capitalist measures, abolition of private property, complete socialization of education, equalization of the remuneration of labor, cultural cosmopolitanism and universality as emancipatory. Instead, such measures were treated as coercive, immature, and totalitarian. So that's on page 309. And funnily enough, and tragically for anyone alive in 2021, the situation led to the full reign of totalitarian capitalism. I think that those not seeing this today, as opposed to 20 years back, must be practicing what I would call political disavowal, despite the current contestation to neoliberalism I've seen in the latest surprise of the USA, which continues with imperialism otherwise. But I will stop this train of thought here for I think I should address what I thought I'm here to address, which is sexuality. It's a big part of Keti's book. And first, I should point out that Keti's findings on sexuality are not all limited, are not all included in the part of the book that bears this heading, sexuality. So you won't find everything there. observations made in the part on political economy are highly relevant to sexuality, and especially to the sexual division of labor. If we take, for instance, her counter-argument 3, and I quote, socialism never overcame the division of labor as it also applied the notions of qualified and unqualified work, unquote. And we connect it to an analysis that relates to social reproduction as discussed in Marxist feminism. This becomes apparent. If the Soviet system did not institute a system of celebrities, as Keti notes, but the system of the heroes of socialist labor, that's also her expression, we want to think about how capitalism managed to sustain a system where women's sacrifice, I'm coming to this word as well, sacrifice in the domestic arena of social reproduction labor provided the basis for the privatization of labor in production, in what's called production. Capitalism had its own commons of labor, allowed to exist precisely because it successfully refused to see it as labor. It had every interest not to do that. So what was it if not labor? I think Keti's theory of surplus can illuminate this, or at least it has to me in my own possibly solipsistic reading of those parts of the book, that it was the surplus of femininity that provided the free, taken for granted pool of non-labor. It was connected to self-realization and satisfaction, the infamous uselessness of the bourgeois woman, free from the constraints of the world of labor, to which all women should aspire. I mean, we know this from the 19th century in our history. Should they want another discipline, should they want to realize their femininity. And no, this ideological position has not left us, despite the Western liberal feminist movement connecting women's emancipation to the wage, to the right to be hired for money. But Keti notes something, I don't know, tragic, I would call it, in my view at least, in the history of global feminism, that there was a search for, and I quote, latent narratives of gender difference and hidden sexualities amidst an otherwise coercively desexualized totalitarian culture. Implicit gender manifestations, underground feminisms, and clandestine representations of sexuality are sought out in the forbidden unofficial culture and shadow economy. This stance prevailed in Eastern cultural studies and curatorial projects in the aftermath of 1989. That's on page 122 of the book. And as far as I remember from my first research-related travel to post-socialist Estonia, it was worse than that, and that was back in the 90s. The post-socialist society had to catch up under the principle of acceleration in the 90s. It had to do feminism very quickly and then move on to post-feminism, all in the same decade. Because, you know, in the 90s, feminism and its body of discourse were supposed to be capitalism's past. So the struggle had ended, we were told, I remember this very clearly. And so, you know, this post-feminism idea. And so the relics of Soviet communism met the relics of Western capitalist feminism, which was amazing. I mean, I was one of them, not quite knowing what to do. And has this encounter been narrated by contemporary transnational feminist scholarship? No. But I'm optimistic that following Keti's book, the road is open for this kind of possibly revolutionary revisionism. Now, to leave this ups in history, I'm going to move quickly to the key observation that in capitalist societies, I quote Keti, the subject is subjugated in itself by the virtue of creating itself. Keti says this by thinking about Judith Butler. She says, in fact, that for Butler, such a free remainder is the gendered body and its psychic dimension that sustains and functions as the minimal but genuine agency capable of evading and subverting the biopolitics of social control. That's on page 124. But hey, this free remainder is indeed to be argued about any emancipatory discourse, becoming, as Keti notes, a metaphysical, somehow divine in its elusiveness, propeller towards the inevitability of progress. This surplus, for me, it's like Benjamin's angel of history, but somehow different. It looks backwards to all the piling defeats, but does not see them, and thus remains assured that like it's moved towards a future, the future being the realm of the possible. And I think this has helped feminism deny its history as one with more defeats than victories. And the consequence of that is, it continues being, the belief that reforms is all that feminism needs. The flourishing of subcultures is part of this, and not only where feminism is concerned. But where feminism is concerned, I would say that my experience as an activist rather than a writer, it certainly proves Keti right. Anyone who has recently gone to a rally, to a demonstration, has experienced a feminist one, especially the exuberance of small scale excess and the feeling of freedom attached to being a carrier of counter-normality. And the designation and expansive politics of queerness against an engulfing normality, which is absolutely engulfing, I would say is testament to this. The question I would put to Keti, however, is that as liberalism is coming crashing down in many parts of the world today, how do we see the situation developing? This state of affairs, in my view, threatens to lock us long-term into an attachment to the politics of the unruly surplus, but maybe there's another view in this. Finally, I'll make a small note, minimal note on aesthetics, which is a section that is impossibly rich and I really cherished. And I do this because I want to highlight in it Keti's attention to the concept and the paradigm of keros. The moment, as he says, of actualization, I quote her, when understanding is impossible and consciousness makes an impossible cognitive leap to grasp the otherwise cognitively ungraspable gap. That's on page 185. I think Keti is very harsh on contemporary art, especially in its socially engaged form. Caught between a rock and a hard place, it neither alienates nor de-alienates, is my reading of what Keti says. And so what does it do? I think it's very hard to answer this question. It needs to be answered. It involves many people who are connected to this paradigm. And with this, I'll stop. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Angela. That's brilliant. And your engagement also with these dimensions of Keti's book was really welcome here. It's beginning to make me think that perhaps we need to publish these responses in written form as well as in recording, so that we can truly kind of digest all of the complexities of not only Keti's work but also your responses to it. So finally, we move on to Samo Tomsic, whose book I have here, The Capitalist Unconscious, the most sort of systematic, I think, today study of the relationship between Marxism and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Samo is currently a researcher at the, I believe this is up-to-date, by the Interdisciplinary Laboratory Image Knowledge Gestaltung at the Humboldt University in Berlin. His research areas comprise contemporary European philosophy, structuralism and post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, epistemology, and political philosophy. And a more recent publication since The Capitalist Unconscious is The Labor of Enjoyment from 2018. So Samo, over to you. And I also just want to draw everyone's attention to the, if no one's noticed, the extremely vigorous discussion ongoing in the chat. So feel free to contribute to that. Samo, over to you.
Thank you. So I guess I should begin with an information that probably none of you knows, namely that Keti and I have a running gag going. She accuses me of being a social democrat, whereas I suspect her of being a Stalinist. So if I was invited here in order to practice self-criticism, this would actually prove my point. Or perhaps I'm expected to play the social democratic clown, which will be a little bit difficult, given that I do not subscribe to social democracy. I think social democracy and Stalinism have one feature in common. They refuse to think the role of alienation in the production of subjectivity, and they construct a fantasy of an ideal regulative social condition that is somehow either has to be imposed or it is kind of presupposed in, you know, all this social democratic naivety. So there might be a certain fundamental disagreement between Keti and me on this terrain, because for me psychoanalysis is as crucial as critique of political economy if one wants to not only avoid becoming either a social democrat or a Stalinist, but also to avoid thinking in purest terms when it comes to the question of social condition and the question of the structure of subjectivity and all the antagonisms that traverse this structure. So I guess one could, one could easily read Keti's book in two ways. On the one hand, one could say there is a certain idealization or assumption that Soviet communism is already a fully actualized social condition. Or one could read it in a materialist way, and this is the direction that I would go in, and recognizing in Soviet communism an impure social condition, which has its own internal struggles, its own internal contradictions, and also it produces its own forms of alienation. Now, allow me a little bit of scholasticism. Alienation is an extremely misfortunate notion. In English, there are plenty of problems related to the term, and I think a lot of misunderstandings or disagreements that Keti and I have or seem to have are basically coming down to the fact that alienation as a term is problematic in English. When we speak of alienation, we must bear in mind, I think, that this term translates several German notions which are crucial in Marx and Hegel. And for Hegel, we would probably agree that he was the first thinker of alienation as a process which is constitutive for the subject and for historicity. So two German notions are Veräußerung, externalization, and Entfremdung, estrangement. And to this couple comes then the third, the properly economic term or economic dimension of alienation, and Eignung, dispossession. And private property is a form of Enteignung, is a form of dispossession. More fundamentally, Hegel and Marx address alienation as constitutive for the movement of history. In Hegel's case, it is a process of self-externalization of spirit, also it's self-overcoming in the process of temporality. And this process is not without change, it's transformation. History is a history of transformations of spirit, which doesn't exist in itself as some kind of metaphysical substance, which then kind of falls into the history and says, oops, now I'm temporal and I have to find my way back to the self. One could say that Hegel has an emergent notion of spirit. So it's emergence of this immaterial symbolic dimension in the material historic process. And I think this is where Keti and I are starting to approach each other in a certain form of agreement. In any case, the notion of alienation, and that's the reason why I work with it, addresses the fact that subject is never an ontologically complete or stable substance, but an existence thrown out of joint, an existence comprising difference, which makes of the subject precisely a process. And communism is a process of construction of an inclusive subjectivity, in difference to the capitalist construction of an exclusive and competitive subjectivity. So I think this is one aspect that I miss in Keti's discussion of alienation, this internal complexity of the term and possible significations. And that's why I think that she has this tendency of equating alienation with capitalist forms of alienation and reducing alienation down to private property and to the estrangement that comes along with it. But blending out the historical fact that she nevertheless acknowledges in other parts of the book that there were such things that as specifically communist forms of alienation. For instance, the Stalinist absolute state and the regression that Stalin represents in the vicissitudes of Soviet communism. And we know what role the state plays in Marx. It is a form of externalization, a form of alienation, if you want. And I would say, I am not one of those people who are a priori against the state. I completely agree that one should think state also in terms of a certain care for certain sociality. But this is not the case with the Stalinist absolute state. This I would insist. Another remark that I cannot help making, given that I've been infected with the Lacanian virus, Keti's critique of libido and of enjoyment, I think, although I sympathize with aspects of it, I cannot agree with the restriction of libido to surplus enjoyment. In Freud, there is a historical theory of enjoyment, a history of enjoyment, a history of what he calls destinies of the drive, Triebschicksale. And these destinies can also be transformed. I mean, otherwise psychoanalysis would not be possible. So psychoanalysis as a practice is focused precisely on such transformation. And I think Marx was also focusing on such transformation. Let's just remember that he called Capital the drive, So, and Capital is a book about the emergence of the modern vicissitude of the drive. And I would recall here, Lacan at some point coined the term surplus enjoyment with which Keti is working, but he coined it not in order to name enjoyment as such or libido as such, but to pinpoint the specifically capitalist form of enjoyment, rooted in the nexus of satisfaction and dissatisfaction, hence marked by an impossibility of satisfaction. And I would here bring, Keti's thesis that the capitalist subject desires alienation into the plane, with a clarification that we must keep in mind that this desire is not something voluntary or even conscious. Rather, it is compulsive. And the subject is the effect of this compulsion rather than its grounding. It's not the subject that desires alienation. It's not critiques of capitalism that desire alienation. It's capital itself that desires it, because capitalism is anchored in not simply alienation, but in exploitation of alienation. So, for me, communism would be, and that's why, I was described as social democrat by Keti. because I understand alienation in the sense of unstable structure of the subject. And for me, sociality means precisely a system of care for this instability and reversing, well, like Keti would say, de-alienating. I would use the term working through, Freud's notion of working through. I think these two notions, alienation, de-alienation and working through, describe the very same thing. So I would conclude with a little remark on capitalism. So capitalism is characterized, among other features, by a hostility towards society. It is fundamentally antisocial and educates us into antisociality. And we are today living in an epoch that Balibar characterized with the term absolute capitalism. So the absolutization of capitalism reflects in the ultimate attempt of capitalism to self-naturalize or self-ontologize in the guise of the climate breakdown. This gives a specific twist to the old Fred Jameson's proverb that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So now it seems impossible to imagine any other end of the world than in the guise of the dismantling of the social and ecological conditions of life. And what we have here is a negative capitalist naturalism, which strives to actualize the old pessimistic view of political philosophers, according to which human is an antisocial animal, an evil animal, forming what Kant called the race of devils. So one could say that we live in an epoch in which we are all facing the imperative of practicing the evil, to invert Keti's book title. And of course, the big question is, can we be re-educated back into not only imagining, but also implementing something like a common good or communality of the good. And yes, I guess this is where the apparent, the incompatibility between my project and Keti's project starts to intersect. And I would just say, let us not give up on psychoanalysis and its capacity to contribute to the determination of what common good is and how it can be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Samo. Great. I fully endorse your defense of the shrinks. So that was really absolutely extraordinary series of reflections from everyone. And I'm sure I've seen Keti vigorously writing everything down. I'm aware also that we have 117 people still in the audience, and many of them have been making interesting comments in the margins. So perhaps it would be good to open the floor up now, unless Keti, you want to make a brief, if you have a kind of universal response to everyone in the form of a quotation, poem.
I would respond everyone at once because we are short of time. Well, first of all, thanks, because it was really incredibly contributing and enriching. Well, I just want to say that it's really good that I have to face so many accusations, because I'm already used to it, because this book is constructed so that I have to accept constantly these accusations from various sides: aesthetics, political economy, psychoanalysis. But just to say that if I were to provide any remedies how to deal with those operatic problems, then I would be myself the chairman of a communist party or whatever, which I'm not. So actually, it's important to keep in mind that with the lack of historiography in my book, which is a drawback, but which is a reality too, it's an exercise in logical constructions and in allegations rather than in assertions of certain things. And just to quickly comment on what Boris has said. Again, this is very important, that it's not that I have to assert the idea of power or of the state and claim that if we had the Soviet state, then let's support the state precisely. But to ask this question, can we deny the idea of law and order by definition, even before we understand what this law can be at all? And we definitely have to face this dismissal, total dismissal of common good in the critical theory, which also claims which also emphasizes the split between communalization, commons, and the good. And the leftist agenda became more associated with commons, but the idea of the good was dismissed and lost, and we have to deal with this. And I think Samo's comment also has to do with it. To what extent we have to testify and witness this split between the commons and the good. And I would say that I would never diminish the importance of psychoanalysis, and my book even could be just blamed in having too much psychoanalytic references. Actually, I totally agree with this analysis of difference between Veräußerung and Fremdung and Enteignung. And I would never speak about ontological alienation critically, which goes without saying. But when it comes to libidinal issues, I mean, actually, Samo was reproducing what is claimed in the book. Yes, Marx is focusing on the capital as drive, and yes, desiring alienation is compulsive and is inevitable. And indeed, Lacan is talking precisely about capitalist enjoyment as surplus enjoyment. But the question is to what extent it is surpassable or unsurpassable. So the question is not how to what terms to use, de-alienation or working through alienation, but the question is whether we need this surpassing beyond the surplus value economics, and to what extent it hinges on a certain complex of desires which cannot be, which cannot expire in this eternity of capitalism. Well, also commenting on Vijay, Vijay's note. I remember Vijay's note about poor countries effectuating revolution, precisely poor countries, as against Marx's statement that we need advanced productive forces to effectuate revolution. Nevertheless, we come across the paradox that these are precisely poor countries that came to revolution. So I would agree here that we cannot demand perfection, but we can simply analyze what happened with the Marxist idea of social transformation in the cultural leftist theory. I think this is extremely important. And I would answer Angela later about Kairos, because this would take me really long. Kairos is this topic on aesthetics. So, yeah.
Thank you, Keti, for a pretty pithy and concise response to a series of questions, accusations, provocations, and interrogations. I wonder now, there's such an extraordinary amount of comments. I'm going to just go through the list of people who've made comments, and I'm going to ask them if they want to verbalize them, because I think that's better than me reading them out loud. But I will ask that if you do verbalize if you do ask your comment out loud, please do so in no more than one sentence. And we'll take 3 at a time. We've already had a bunch in the chat, so I'll go through those in the chat first. And then if we get onto those not in the chat, we'll be able to do that. So, well, Sarah, the first question was yours. Do you want to ask that out loud about the father? You're muted.
No, I don't.
Okay.
But I think I'd like a private conversation about the libidinal things with Keti. And I'd just like to say that no one ever knows that she quotes a lot of Meradashvili, that he spent a lot of time talking to Althusser one-on-one in Moscow in 1974. It would be really interesting to know, particularly as he had psychoanalysis himself and was very close to Lacan, what that conversation was all about.
That's great. And then there were many questions and comments from ID. Is ID still with us? And do you have a one-sentence summary? No ID. Okay. There were several questions and comments from Ralph Dumas. Ralph, Dumas, I can see, but perhaps they don't want. Perhaps we can.
You can simply just read the question.
I'll read them out. Yeah, one of them was Western Marxism was a point that Western Marxism was distinct because it had to reflect on the complexities of advanced technological bourgeois democracy. There were several responses. There was a whole sub-conversation between Ralph Dumas and Igor Shoichetbrod about Western Marxism. Then Andrzej Nowak, you had a comment about vaccination and Burkina Faso.
Can I ask a question? This is
Sure.
Igor Shoichetbrod.
Yes, of course.
I was just as an invitation to elaborate on Vijay Prashad's point about Western Marxism not having to contend with being in power, which I think is helpful, and also to connect that to some of the state repression that also grew out of that problem in the Soviet Union and in the so-called Eastern Bloc. If that can be elaborated upon, my view personally is that socialism has a history, just like capitalism. So we shouldn't quote unquote whitewash it, but also learn from its errors, its crimes, as well as its accomplishments. So I just want to hear a bit more on this.
Okay, well, let's collect a couple more questions, and then we can ask if any of the speakers have responses to them. Corina Lotz had a point. Okay.
Sorry, I was talking.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, thank you, Michal. I'm very dumbfounded by the lack of critique of Stalinism, and I think what Samo said was very important. The fact that there was alienation in the Stalinist, massive alienation. I think it's really important to understand that this is a contradictory situation, and you can't brush over these terrible sides of things. And I thought that was a bit of a problem, to say the least. Thank you.
Thank you. And then perhaps one more point from Jordan Osserman, which was a concrete question. Perhaps it's easier if I read it out. Question for Keti: could you say a bit about your use of Vygotsky in the book and how it relates to your Lacanian framework on libidinal economy? So that's enough collection for now. I think we have about 10 minutes left, Patricia, if that's right. Before
really difficult to deal with this. Well, I would start with the last question about Vygotsky and about the post-human issue that all these questions, I think, belong to Kirill Potapov, if I'm not mistaken. And I would say that Vygotsky was not the central figure in the book, but rather he was in the context of the critique of psychoanalysis in the works of Voloshinov, Ilyenkov, and Vygotsky in the group to claim the non-psychoanalytical treatment of the language, non-structuralist treatment on the language, which presupposes that it's not the unconscious that precedes the linguistic categories, but what precedes the linguistic category is already the universal materiality. So what is behind the language is not the unconscious, something suppressed, but is the universal objective, objective reality. So the language then is treated not in a structuralist or post-structuralist way as some kind of suppression of materiality and suppression of the unconscious, but certain kind of extension and conceptual development of the material reality, which can be ascribed to the Spinozist condition of both Ilyenkov and Vygotsky. But as well, what was important in the book, the argument of Vygotsky with Piaget in terms of psychology of the child to claim the initiality, the initial amount of the common and general construct of child's mentality as against the private and individualist treatment of things. As for a post-human issue, I didn't quite understand why Kirill is so much insisting on the post-humanist agenda with the Marxist context and with Ilyenkov. So maybe Kirill could account for this himself. As for Stalinism that Corina is mentioning, I think when Vijay mentioned DDR, he would in no way claim or insist on certain emancipatory potentiality of Stalinist state or Stalinist methods of dealing with the sociality, not at all. But again, we cannot confine the socialist background to Stalinist history predominantly, and I think the point of Vijay was also about it, that the emancipatory elements which are part and parcel of the whole history are lost as we criticize Stalinist context in the frame of liberal critique. And what was another question? Please remind me. Maybe someone, I mean, maybe Samo or Boris or Vijay would also like to comment on it.
Well, maybe just a remark about Stalinism. I'm not sure that we can characterize this time as ideal state, or because the state was subjected to the rule of Communist Party, which was not in itself a state organization. So the actual construction of power in the Soviet Union is not so easy question to answer. Yeah, it should be specifically investigated. Then one should say that the Stalinist period, at least the 30s, was a time of continuation of the civil war, de facto. So it was continuous struggle among different fractions in the Soviet Communist Party, and civil war was cruel. And what happened after that was also cruel. Mm-hmm. And this extreme cruel form, cruel violence, was produced by other sides of the story. I would say that the real end of the civil war in the Soviet Union came with the death of Stalin and de-Stalinization, the process of de-Stalinization. So when I think about Soviet Union, I speak about Soviet Union in a state of peace after the end of the civil war. So at the moment of de-Stalinization and release of the prisoners from the labor camps, yeah, that was actually a relic of the civil war. And then the question, what happened to the socialism, not in the state of the war, yeah, as a military camp, as Bogdanov, for example, characterized this period of the Soviet history. I think what's interesting is a period of peace, yeah, of the inner peace of the after the civil war. That is interesting problem here. Why the socialism could not stand in peace? Yeah, not in a struggle, but in peace. Mm-hmm. I think that is interesting theoretical problem. And I read the book by Keti as answer to this problem. The problem of Stalinism is not so relevant. The relevant is what happened after him.
Thank you, Boris. That's great, and I think that's precisely what Keti really hammers home in her book, the response to that question. And perhaps we will learn from reading Keti's book that the question of Stalinism isn't always the most relevant one. But there's a couple more questions to read out quickly. Andrei Gerasimov has an interesting question for Keti. Could you elaborate on the relation between language and the way you understand the demise of libidinality in the USSR? How can sexuality be limited to categories like necessity, where there is still a lack related to language and the real? There's also a question from Zegam Azizov, I think. Would you like to ask it out loud, because I can't find it in the list?
Oh, okay, thank you. It wasn't really a question, it was a comment. I wanted to say, thanks to Keti Chukhrov for posing this very important question. But another thing came to me also in relation to Boris Groys's comment to Keti's work, when he mentioned this Greek notion of virtue. But also, I think, and then there was a question about psychoanalysis. But I think we live, and it's my maybe big opinion, that perhaps we should return to the question of Greek dialectics, which is called pharmakon. That's also the poison becoming the condition of the remedy, and other way around. So, and precisely because we live, it's also true of Stalinism, I think, in some ways. But I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there were also questions from John Cootie, I think, but I didn't know whether he wants to ask it out loud.
Hello, yes, I could try. Okay. This is a historical question, just because I understand that the book is about the 1960s and 70s, to try to apply this analysis to a particular event from that period.
Okay. Thank you. And I think this will be the last round of questions. So I'm going to just ask Keti and the others for final responses.
Just.
Mm-hmm. If anybody does want to jump in with an urgent final question, just write it down in the chat. But anyway, Keti, over to you.
I will start with answering Andrei Gerasimov, because this question is crucial, really. How to deal with sequestered libidinality when language already contains this lack? Well, I will answer by an example from a famous Soviet Russian artist, Boris Mikhailov, who was very famous for photographing the gendered and naked bodies, and he claims that the sexual body appears only in the 80s in the Soviet Union. So what is that? There is sexual intercourse, but there is no sexuality. How to deal with this? Which means that language can be defined by the type of production, and the type of production and whether this type of production is based on phantasmatic idea and phantasmatic surplus value economics changes the application of the language. And since sexuality is also the language, first and foremost, sexuality is not simply intercourse, but it deals with the production of the language, we can understand how the political economic construction, when private property and the surplus is totally evicted and abolished from the exchange, can affect the production of bodies and consequently the production of the type of the languages and semantic construction of the language. Yeah.
I think probably, unless there's any final comments, this is a good point to end. A full stop, quite literally.
I did not answer Angela's point about remainder of surplus, remainder of gender, but this demands that people know what we are talking about. Also, the critique of contemporary art through the notion of kairos. So I would just mention that, yes, indeed, Judith Butler is definitely talking about gender as the remainder, and that what I want to emphasize that the remainder is a clinical category. So my question when I analyze Judith Butler is, how can a psychic clinical category that gender as the remainder is, when sociality is by definition subjugative, how can it become an agency and resistant? Well, I don't know the answer to this question, and thank you, Angelo, for bringing forth this question.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, I think that the IAS needs the bandwidth, needs the room for Paul Gilroy's inaugural. So we're going to finish now. But this has been an absolutely extraordinary discussion. I've seen there's also a lot of speculation about what the book may be about in the chat. So I recommend that anybody who is speculating on this topic goes out and buys the book. It's only about $20 online, and you can also get it from JSTOR. In PDF form. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Keti. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Angela.
Michal, could you please somehow provide all the comments so that they are not lost?
Yes, I think, Patricia, the comments will be saved when we save.
Yes.
Save the questions and save the comments, which are very precious and very important. And
yes, exactly. Yeah, and also I did some screenshots just in case, but it's gonna be recorded everything, so don't worry.
Great, and the recording will be on the channel, on the IAS YouTube channel, right? Presumably.
I will send you the link so you can share it with whatever you want, and with the permission of everyone, we can put it on the website.
Fantastic, and we should also publish the transcripts of this discussion somewhere. So if anyone's got a a magazine they want to publish it in, please let us know.
So thank you everyone for interventions and questions, and my gratitude.
Yes, it was a fantastic event, and see you again. Check out ppv.life, and we'll also put the link up to the discussion on ppv.life. I'm blown away and need to process everything for a bit. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.